Hi, my name is Derek Estes. I'm a member here at the Simi Church of Christ. I filled in for Daniel a couple of weeks ago on this sermon from John chapter 20, and we'll start in verse 1. I'll read. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went toward the tomb. And the two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple, who reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to their homes. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." And she turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. And Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them what he had said these things to her. When Daniel, the preacher here at Simi, asked me a few weeks ago to preach a sermon, I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to preach on. And in between the time he asked me and the few weeks that I was scheduled to preach the sermon, I went on a camping trip to Yosemite National Park. And I don't know if you've ever been to Yosemite National Park, but it's just gorgeous there. And one thing you should know about my wife who planned the trip is that she's sort of a super researcher. Whenever she's interested in something, she just goes into research mode. She wants to know everything about it. And so when she was planning this trip, she did it again. She went into research mode and she looked up everything there was to know about Yosemite National Park. You know, all the great places to go in the park, where the best campsites were, what the best dates were to be there for the weather. And, so it's not too hot, it's not too cold. And she had everything figured out, and she found the most perfect camping sites. And she got on at exactly the right time online when you were supposed to get on to get your site booked. And she got on right at, I think it was 9 in the morning or something. And she was at her computer on the right website. And as soon as the clock hit 9, she booked the spot. And I'm convinced it has to be the most beautiful camping spot in the world, maybe. It's this spot that is sort of at the cross of two, there's a creek on one side and a river on the other, and they sort of meet, and right where they meet, this campsite is right here. So you have water on both sides, running water on both sides. And there's a lot of trees, so the campsite is shaded, but the trees sort of open up at the corner where the waters meet, and in the distance you can see the cliffs of Yosemite, and if you've been there, you know how impressive they are. And right in the middle, if you look off from this campsite, in the middle of the cliffs, what you'll see is Yosemite Falls, one of the most famous waterfalls in Yosemite National Park. And it's just this unbelievable sight. And I remember we were there with my parents. And my mom, this is the first time she's been in Yosemite, and this campsite is just amazing. And she's looking off at the scenery, and she says, when I think of heaven, this is what I think of. Have you ever had moments like that? Not necessarily camping maybe, but just some moment where, of course, you know that God is always with you. But in that moment, it just feels like God is present in a special kind of way, where you get this kind of glimpse into what it must be, what heaven must be like. Have you had moments like that? Maybe it's at the birth of a child, or maybe it's at the sunset on the beach, or on this like mountaintop experience where you've trekked this long way, or maybe it's in this really special to you worship service where you really feel the presence of God. We've all had those, right? There's a theologian named N.T. Wright. He writes a lot about the New Testament and about God, and he calls these moments where we feel God in a special kind of way, he calls them thin spaces. And he calls them thin spaces because in ordinary life, heaven and earth feel very far away, right? You have earth down here, our life on earth down here, and heaven is way up here. And the space between them is broad and wide. But every now and then, right, at that moment at the sunset on the beach or at the birth of a child, the distance between heaven and earth feels thin, right? It's this space in time and in place that feels like heaven and earth are not very far apart after all, where you catch this glimpse into what heaven must be like, however brief or momentary that glimpse is. We've had those thin space moments. This passage that we just read about in the Gospel of John is one of those thin space moments. To get some background on this passage in John, it helps to understand what's sort of happening throughout the Gospel, right? In the Gospel of John, Jesus is going about preaching and teaching and making disciples. And as he does, he's making these disciples and he's heading slowly but surely towards Jerusalem, where Jesus knows he's going to die. And he tells the disciples he's going to die, but they don't really understand what that means. You know, even though Jesus says, I'm going to Jerusalem, they're going to kill me there, and then I'm going to rise up again, they don't really understand what Jesus is talking about. And so even though they're sort of headed straight there, they're confused. But of course, you know what happens in the Gospel of John. Jesus does go to Jerusalem. He's tried there, and he's hung on a cross, and like Jesus told the disciples, he's killed. And the disciples were devastated by this. I mean, we have the benefit of hindsight, right? When we get to the part in the story where Jesus dies, we know that just like 5 minutes of reading later, just a chapter later, Jesus is going to rise from the dead, and the Savior will not be dead any longer. He'll be risen, and he'll ascend to the right hand of the Father in heaven, right? We know this because we've read the story. We have the benefit of hindsight. But the disciples, when Jesus dies, they think that's the end. There's this story in Luke chapter 24 that I really love, and it talks about two disciples who are on the road after Jesus has died, but before he's resurrected. Actually, it's not before he's resurrected. Jesus is resurrected, but they don't know it yet. They haven't gotten the news. They don't have the benefit of the internet, I suppose, where news travels like this. They are traveling. Jesus has been resurrected, but they don't know it. And so they're on the road, they're dejected, they're devastated, and they're traveling to this place called Emmaus. And unbeknownst to them, Jesus joins them on the road. It says he appeared on the road and he's traveling along with them. But for some reason, the text says their eyes were kept from knowing who Jesus was, right? These are apostles, disciples of Jesus. They should know what Jesus looks like, but for whatever reason, in Jesus' resurrected body, their eyes are kept from recognizing Jesus. And so Jesus is walking along with the disciples. He's resurrected from the dead after his crucifixion, but they don't know it. They think Jesus is still dead, and they don't realize he's walking with them, right? Here's how Luke writes. Now on that day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all the things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you were walking?" And then they stood still, looking sad. One of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place in these days?" Jesus asked them, "What things?" And they replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. but we had hoped he was the one to redeem Israel." Can't you just hear the sadness in their voices? We had hoped. The disciples thought Jesus was dead. They thought this man that they had believed in, who they hoped would restore the kingdom of Israel, had failed. Kings aren't killed on a cross, right? So when we get to the story we read in John chapter 20, Jesus had died, and the disciples have pretty much given up hope. Jesus has been killed on a cross, and his disciples are now grappling with how they're supposed to get on with their lives now that their master is dead. But then, just when all hope is lost, there's news that the tomb has been found empty. But you know what the disciples' first thought was? Not that Jesus has been resurrected, of course, despite the fact that he's told them he would be already. No, they think his body has been stolen by someone. So in John 20, Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb and sees for herself, and when she gets there, she sees the tomb is empty indeed. But she also sees something else. She sees two angels, one at the head of where Jesus was laid, and one at the foot. And the angels ask Mary, "Woman, why are you crying?" And Mary, still not realizing that Jesus has been resurrected, not stolen, tells them she's agonized because someone has stolen the body of Jesus, she thinks. But just as she says this, she turns around and she sees Jesus. But like the disciples on the way to Emmaus, she doesn't realize it's Jesus. For some reason, her eyes are kept from recognizing him. And so, when she turns around and unknowingly sees Jesus, he asks her the same questions the angels asked her. He asks, "Woman, why are you crying?" And it's at this point that John includes a fascinating little detail. He writes, "And thinking he was the gardener, she said, 'Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will go to him.'" Did you catch that? And thinking he was the gardener. To understand why John includes this, we need to go all the way back to the very beginning of the Bible, to the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. You remember, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He created the heavens above. He created the sea below. He created the earth and all the plants and the animals that lived on it. He filled the waters with fish. He filled the sky with birds. God made the dry land. God made the trees and the flowers and all the animals of the earth. And then, at last, at the culmination of his creation, God made man and woman. And to that man and that woman, Adam and Eve, God left a simple task. Tend the Garden of Eden and keep it. When God made Adam and Eve, God created them as co-laborers with him in the ongoing creation of the world and of the maintenance of nature itself. Adam and Eve were gardeners, appointed as such by God. And in this role, Adam and Eve were in perfect relationship with God. They talked with God, they walked with God, and they lived in God's loving presence. But of course, we know how the story ends, don't we? Adam and Eve do not stay as gardeners for long because they eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which God had forbidden them to do. And as a consequence, they were cast out of the garden that they were originally supposed to keep. No longer would they be in God's presence. Instead, they were forced to labor and toil to grow from the soil of the earth. And they were cast out where life would be difficult, where the ground would not yield its fruit easily, and where there would be sin, and where they would no longer walk in the presence of God. And so, from that moment on, every single person you read about in the Bible is in one way or another trying to find their way back to the Garden of Eden. Not literally, not to a physical location where the garden actually was, but figuratively. What every person in the Bible is trying to do, what we're trying to do, is find a way back to that place where there is a perfect relationship between God and people, between God and us, right? That relationship that Adam and Eve had, where they walked in the garden with God. But of course, we know that People never find their way back. For one reason or another, there are always these interruptions to the relationship with God, always on the part of us, humans. What we need, therefore, in the Bible is a new Adam. Someone who's able to restore humanity back to right relationship with God, who can show us the way back to the presence of God that was perfect bliss, right? A new Garden of Eden. And guess what? In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says Jesus is the new Adam. He puts it like this: "So it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being, but the last Adam, that is Jesus, became a life-giving spirit." Paul makes the same point elsewhere. In Romans 5, Paul writes that Jesus is the new Adam. The first Adam sinned, and death entered the world through that sin. But through the second Adam, through one great act of righteousness and the death on the cross, Jesus provides forgiveness for sin. Through the man Adam, death spreads to all, but through the man Jesus, life is given eternal. And so when Mary Magdalene, here in John chapter 20, stands at the tomb weeping and turns and sees Jesus, when she thinks he's the gardener, she sees rightly. Are you with me? She's wrong in one sense, of course. When she sees the empty tomb, and she's weeping because she doesn't think that Jesus is resurrected, but she thinks rather that someone has stolen his body from the tomb. She turns and sees someone that she thinks is a gardener. Basically, you can think of it as the person whose job it was to tend the cemetery. And thinking he's the gardener, her first thought is, this person has been around this cemetery an awful lot, this tomb an awful lot. Maybe he's the one that's stolen Jesus' body. And in that sense, of course, if that's what she's thinking, she's wrong. The person she sees is Jesus, not the person whose job it is to keep the cemetery. But she's right in another way, isn't she? The resurrected Jesus is the gardener, the new Adam, the one who's come to return humanity to the Garden of Eden, to the presence of God. In the resurrected Jesus, we see the ultimate thin space where heaven and earth, far apart normally, meet. Jesus does not leave Mary in the dark, though. He speaks just her name, Mary, and immediately she recognizes him. And John writes something interesting. When Jesus said to her, Mary, John writes, she turned toward him. Isn't that odd that John would say this? Because just a few verses earlier, when Mary was speaking to the angels, John writes, the angels asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they've put him." At this, John writes, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not recognize it was Jesus. She turned around and saw Jesus? So when John writes in verse 16, Jesus said to her, Mary, and she turned toward him and cried out, Rabboni, wasn't she already turned towards Jesus? What's happening here? Well, yes, physically, she's already facing Jesus. So in that sense, yes, she's turned towards him physically. But when Jesus said Mary, it was not her face or her eyes that suddenly turned towards Jesus. It was her heart. Genuine encounters with the resurrected Jesus tend to do that, don't they? They turn our hearts toward him. And Mary's heart was turned so strongly towards Jesus that she clings to him. So much so, in fact, that Jesus has to say, "Don't hold on to me." He's not yet ascended to the Father, he tells her. Instead, he tells her, "Go and tell my brothers what you have seen, that he's resurrected." And you know what Mary does? Well, she goes and tells the apostles the good news of Jesus' resurrection. How could she not? She encountered the resurrected Jesus. And when you encounter the resurrected Jesus, when your heart is turned towards him, you can't help but share it with others. Amen? And you know what that means? It means that Mary was the first person to declare the gospel, the good news of Jesus' resurrection from the dead and defeat over death itself. I don't know about you, but I for a long time thought Peter was the first to declare the gospel when he preached the first gospel sermon at Pentecost in Acts 2. But look closely. It was Mary who was first. That's why early Christians sometimes called Mary the apostle to the apostles. Jesus chose Mary to be the first to break the good news to the world. Jesus is risen, and he's coming again. This story in John chapter 20 is one of the reasons I love the Lord's Supper, which we take every Sunday morning. Because just a few short days before Mary mistook Jesus for a gardener, or was it a mistake? Jesus was with the disciples for a meal. And at that meal, he broke bread and told them, "Take, eat, this is my body, broken for you." And he took the cup and he said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Whenever you drink it, do so in remembrance of me." And so each Sunday, we take the bread and we take the cup, and we do so with the recognition that it was in the person of the resurrected Jesus that we see the ultimate thin space, the place where heaven and earth meet, where we catch a glimpse into heaven and know what it looks like. Because it is on Easter that we, like Mary, see in Jesus a gardener. So may you see in Jesus a gardener, the new Adam, the one who can restore us to right relationship with God and return us to God's loving presence. May you find in the world thin places, places where heaven and earth meet, where they come so close that it's as if we've caught a brief glimpse into heaven itself. And may you, like Mary, believe this good news and share it with all who will listen. Thank you.